So I think we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for coming. We have a really full house today, which is really exciting. Our enrichment training started very small as something we did once a month, several times a year, and they have just taken off in the last couple months. And obviously this is a topic people are really interested in. So I guess I will introduce myself first. I am Anna Semple. I am the coordinator for the Healthy Start Coalition as well as Youth Development Network. Youth Development Network is who puts this on. And I work for the Missoula Forum for Children and Youth. So just give you a little info about the forum before we jump in. So the forum is an office in the Department of Grants and Community Programs at the county. And we focus on underage substance abuse prevention through coalition work. So we really believe in community-wide projects. We know that Missoula has so many nonprofits and government agencies and people that are working to help keep our kids healthy and safe. And we really feel that we need to help network that and do community-wide projects in order to make that happen. So this training is a part of our efforts in that area. We really think we need to be holistic about it and think about the whole lifespan of, you know, how can we help parents raise young children? How can we help kids get what they need when they're younger so that later on they're making healthy choices, as well as working with teenagers. So really have to look at it from all perspectives. And with no further ado, we're just going to jump into the ACE study. I am one of 21 trainers in the ACE interface program that we have here in Montana. We're across the state. We have 2 trainers in the back, Teresa Nygaard and Lorraine Bond as well. So 3 of us here. If you're looking afterwards to book trainings for your staff or for longer presentations, we're all available for that. We'll have more info at the end. But basically, we are trying to get the word out about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study to as many people as possible, because it really applies to every walk of life, to parents, to policymakers, to service providers, you name it. If you are around a kid or somebody who used to be a kid, which is all of us, then this really applies to your life and your work. Before we jump into the topic, I just want to acknowledge that when you're learning about this, you kind of have 2 hats on at all times, your personal hat and your professional hat. So I know everyone, as they're learning about it, is thinking about their own life. They're thinking about their friends, their family, you know, that kid down the street that they see that maybe isn't getting everything they need. And so we really have to think about that and acknowledge that everybody's going through that. We're not going to talk today about personal stories, but it is really important to know that that's really what's going on for each of us. And so it's really meaningful because of that, and it really has a lot of implications and hits close to home in a lot of ways. So just know that we're all thinking about that together. So before we start, can I get an idea of people who have maybe heard presentations about the ACE study before, are kind of familiar with it? All right. And then how many people is this kind of brand new information? You're just learning about it for the first time. Oh, this is awesome. So about 50-50. That's really great. Every time I have learned about ACEs, I learn a little bit more. So I think those of you who have heard of it before are going to get some new information. And those of you that are brand new to the topic are going to get a whole lot of information today. I have handouts at the end. I didn't want them at the beginning because there's so much information. I didn't need everybody fiddling around and looking at that instead of looking at the presentation. But no, especially when we're talking about brain stuff or technical information, you don't have to memorize everything. I will have information for you at the end, so don't stress out about it. Just kind of take it in. And if you have more questions, through this ACE interface program, we have boatloads of materials that they give us. So I'm happy to provide that to everybody as needed. You can email me. We can talk afterwards. So that's about it. If you have questions at any time, go ahead and put your hand up, and we can address them as they come. And I'll try and go fast, reasonably fast, so we have time at the end to address more questions that will come up. All right. So the ACE study really may be one of the largest public health discoveries of our time, and it relates to the smallest among us. It relates to children. And from the very moment when life begins and cells begin to divide and skeleton forms and the nervous system forms, even in the womb, we are learning what it means to be in a relationship with another person. So in the womb, we're dependent 100% on the mother. That relationship is completely present. Later on, as we're born, we interact with the people that care for us, that are around us, our siblings, friends, family. Those relationships really help shape who we are. And we remember a lot of this. We have conscious memories of what happened as we were growing up. But a lot of it isn't just remembered consciously. A lot of it is actually hardwired into the body. And we will learn about that today. So a lot of things that happened maybe while you were still in the womb or shortly after you were born that you don't remember may actually be impacting the life that happens after that. And we get to learn about that today. So we'll start by talking about the brain for about the first third. And that sounds boring sometimes, but it's actually really fascinating and amazing what people have been discovering about brain development. And then we'll jump to talking about the adverse childhood experience study. I'll explain about what it means, what the study was, the implications of it. And then at the end, we get to talk about communities and resilience and kind of what can we do with this and how can we deal with this as a community. So we get all three of those pieces and we can just start talking about the brain. The nervous system, we'll just have a super quick overview. We've got the brain, the spinal cord, the peripheral nerves that come from that. Each nerve cell is called a neuron. And our neurons are constantly picking up information from the world around us, sending it back through that channel, through the spinal cord, up to the brain. And the brain is making snap decisions, sending the reaction back out through the nervous system. And this happens instantaneously. We don't think about it all the time. Heartbeat is being regulated, temperature, fear responses. A lot of this is happening without our conscious processing of it. It's something that's happening subconsciously or kind of automatically. So here are some examples of neurons. And on this side, I guess this is your left, we have neurons at birth. What does anybody notice about those neurons at birth?
Not a lot.
Not a lot. Yeah, so they're not very branched. When we're born, neurons are pretty simple. Not a lot of branches and not a lot of connections. What do you have to do when you're first born? What are your jobs as a newborn baby? You sleep. You cry. You suckle. Yeah, you have to feed. So you have to stay alive. You have to regulate your heartbeat. You have to sleep. You have to eat. You have to digest. And you really have to be able to connect with somebody that is going to take care of you, because you can't do anything on your own as an infant. You really need that connection with a caregiver that is going to give you what you need and take care of you. And so building that relationship, you need a few connections. Your neurons need to be working and functioning, but they don't need a whole lot of pathways. That changes a whole lot as we grow and get older. So what do you notice about elementary school age kids?
Lots of connections.
Lots of connections. So these same neurons have branches going all different directions, different connections, because kids are learning constantly. They're picking up information about the world, watching people and observing how they interact, learning and discovering about their own selves and the world around them. You're constantly learning and making new pathways within your brain. And that process is called arborization. So like a tree, just like it looks, those branches are created. Now what do you notice in puberty? Yeah, it's pared back down. So not as far as at birth. You still have more connections and more pathways in your brain at puberty. But the brain goes through and says, basically, you can't remember and utilize all the information very efficiently if you have all of the pathways constantly functioning. And it pares down or prunes the pathways that aren't being utilized very much. So basically, the information, the pathways that have been used over and over again are going to stick around, and the ones that maybe you learned about but didn't find useful in your daily life, weren't repeated over and over again, get pruned back. By the way, I am getting all of this information from the ACE Interface program, and it's approved by Dr. Martin Teicher at Harvard University, so you can really trust his brain information for sure. I feel like I learned it well, but we have the best that's supplying all of this info. So the big implication of that is if it comes time for puberty and pruning occurs, if a kid hasn't learned how to have healthy relationships with the world, if they haven't experienced that and practiced that and modeled that, those neural connections aren't as developed, and those will be the ones that might get pruned back. So it's really, really crucial that a child practices and learns what it means to have healthy relationships to get what they need at an early age, or by the time they hit puberty. That will be pruned back, and it'll be a lot harder to develop that later. It'll be a whole lot more work. So whenever we're talking about this, just know that a lot of hard things can happen, and a lot of trauma can happen in a child's life, and a lot can be done to work with that. We just know as adults that it can be a whole lot harder. So I want everyone to keep a little bit of hope in their heart when they're learning about these depressing topics, because really there are ways to deal with a lot of this, but it's not going to be as easy, and there will be a lot more struggle involved. So we really know that lives are complex. We don't have all positive things or all negative things happen in any one life, but we're going to simplify things just for an example right now. We're going to imagine two lives. One that is dangerous, where a child experiences a lot of trauma, where there's abuse or neglect, or a world where things aren't safe. Another world where a child is experiencing pure safety, generosity, benevolence, and really have what they need all of the time: the support, the love, and the nurturing. So this child that has a dangerous life is going to learn to fight, to flight, to run, fight, flight, or freeze, basically. They're going to be constantly on the alert, protecting themselves. And those conditions cause a lot of stress hormones to flood through the body. But they are going to be really prepped and adapted to survive in some tough conditions, because they're trained from the time they're born or before they're born in how to survive in a world where stress is a big part of it. A child that is born into safety and raised in safety is going to have a little bit more time. They're not constantly going to be ready to fight or run or hide. They're going to have time to relate to people, to process things, to think about the future and what possibilities there are in the future. And they're going to be really ready to survive in really good conditions. Now, this top lifestyle we really think about as maladaptive a lot, but honestly, if you're living in a really harsh environment where there isn't a lot of love, it's really highly adaptive to help keep you alive in that situation. The thing that gets difficult is those stress hormones, the cortisol and other stress hormones that are going through your body, really are hard on your brain, hard on your neurons. We're programmed and designed to experience stress for about 15 minutes at a time. And when it's constant, when it's happening all the time, then it can actually be damaging to your nerve cells and can kill some of them. So it's really adaptive to survive in the moment and to survive one challenge to the next. It can be hard in the long run. And it can be really hard when you're put in a social situation that you're not as prepared for. So there's kind of a clue on this slide already. But what are some professions where a child that might be hypervigilant or edgy or emotionally detached, some child that was raised in more of a dangerous life in that dangerous world, what are some professions where they might excel? Firefighter, good job. They give you a big fat clue on this one. Any other ideas?
Law enforcement.
Yeah, law enforcement might be great.
Sniper.
Sniper, yeah. You got to be on. You got to be alert for that.
Football.
Football, yeah. Football could be great. Riot control's another one that is suggested. Daycare. AKA riot control. Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of jobs where having this, this brain chemistry where you have a lot of stress and you are edgy or hypervigilant or able to detach emotionally, that can be really useful in certain situations. However, when our adaptation is different than the expectation society has, it can be a pretty big problem and it can cause some issues. So we've got one of the cutest baby pictures I've ever seen next to a kid getting yelled at. But basically, what do you think happens if a kid who comes from this dangerous world for 4 or 5 years, has been raised in that world where he maybe experiences abuse or neglect, maybe sees his mom being hurt, is around substance abuse, is constantly having stress hormones coursing through the body. What happens when that kid goes to a nice, controlled, orderly kindergarten class?
Misfit.
Yeah, misfit. They get in trouble a whole lot for doing exactly what they had evolved to do. These kids are experts, and then they get put in a situation where they're told they're not experts anymore. They're told they're doing it all wrong, and they don't have the skill set to adapt to that yet. So really the problem is when our expectation as a society collides with what's going on with the kids' chemistry, with their neurons, with the way they're wired. All right, so there are, just really quickly, and we'll talk about this really briefly, different sensitive periods and times where effects of trauma actually have different impacts on your brain. And we'll talk about a little bit of this. I made up a handout that takes all the details of it, and you can just pick that up when you leave if you're having trouble memorizing. I know I learned about the brain in psychology class and in child development class and probably 3 other places, and promptly it goes out of your brain because we got a lot of things to think about. So know that this is in writing later. One of the systems, brain systems that we're going to talk about is the limbic system, and this is something that controls really basic functioning, learning, memory, reward reinforcement. It regulates our hormones, our mood, our heartbeat, sexual behavior. So basic physical actions that you need right away in most cases. Your heartbeat has to be going from the beginning.
Red Impala, a silver Honda, or a black Chevy in the staff parking lot, please move your vehicles.
If anybody needs to go, that's totally okay. All right, so the limbic system is really needed instantly. When you're born, it's something that has to be active and functioning right away and is developing early on. And so it's really impacted by what happens to you early on in life. So like we talked about, tiny babies don't need to think about writing a paper. They don't need to think about, where they're going to go tomorrow and how they're going to prep for this presentation they're doing. They need to think about eating and connecting and surviving. And so this is really the limbic system is where that happens. So this is made up of the hippocampus and the amygdala. It's really important for relationships, your panic and fear responses, for attention, memory, and social cues. So panic and fear, your kind of fight or flight instinct, is regulated by this part of the brain. So what do you think happens in kids that are learning about a traumatic world when they're first born, when this part of the brain is developing? Do you think they're going to have calm and relaxed demeanors? No, their panic and fear regulation is going to be a little bit different or can be damaged. What's a big issue we have related to attention when we have kids in the schools or medical sense?
Not learning.
Not learning, yeah. What's a diagnosis that we're hearing a lot about? ADHD, yeah. So sometimes ADHD can be linked to trauma as well. There's a big tie there, and it can have to do with changes in brain development due to trauma that happens to kids. Not always, and in the case of most of what we're presenting, know that there are lots of contributors, but that ACEs and traumatic experiences are pretty big ones. One really interesting thing about the hippocampus and amygdala is they have what are called seedling cells. So they're cells that are not fully developed when they're born, but they're ready to develop later on in life. And basically, if they sustain damage due to these heightened stress hormones, you won't notice it necessarily right away, but later on in your teen years, in puberty, when they're supposed to develop, they don't develop correctly, and it causes problems later. So something that happens to a child, they may seem fine, and then when those cells are supposed to develop, they don't develop correctly, and there's problems that occur then. So I think we all have seen kids that are just doing fine, they're cruising right along, and they hit puberty, and what happens? There could be a lot of things, but it could definitely be related to these seedling cells. All right, so the cerebellar vermis, we're only talking about 3 different parts of the brain, so you're about a third of the way through. But the cerebellar vermis is the section that controls signals between the two halves of the cerebellum. And it also has seedling cells. I want to read a little bit of this off so that I'm not getting it wrong. I want you guys to have all the right info. But basically, it is what controls our ability to perceive the periphery. So if you're walking along down the street and you're looking where you're going, you're looking for the signs, and there's people talking on the side of the road, you'll notice them that they're there, but it's not going to make you fall on the ground necessarily. It's not going to stop you from getting where you're going. You're going to process that peripheral information, know that it's happening, and keep on your way. So obviously that's really important for attention, and ADHD is really connected with that potentially as well. And it's really important for perceiving what's going on in the larger sense of the world. The cerebellar vermis is also where all of our kind of feel-good feelings or chemicals come from. So dopamine and norepinephrine are released from that part of the brain. And if it's damaged, then they're not released in the same way. So it can really cause a difference in how you feel later on. If your chemicals, the neurotransmitters that make you feel good, are not being released correctly, you're probably going to look for something else that makes you feel good, basically. There's going to be a deficit there, and you're going to be reaching out for something that can help you feel the way that feels good to you, that feels better. So there's a lot of addiction that can be linked to damage to this part of the brain. Attention problems and mental illness. A lot of mental illness, some people call it the seat of mental health. So if there's damage to the cerebellum, it can be linked to disorders like schizophrenia, as well as some things related to anxiety and depression. All right. So moving on to the corpus callosum. And this is kind of the superhighway that connects the two halves of the brain, that integrates things together. The left hemisphere that is more about spatial patterns, math, routine, daily tasks, grammar and vocabulary. So often you hear about it as the more logical, mathematic side of the brain. The right hemisphere is visual and auditory processing, processing new situations. When you're in a brand new place, that's the side of the brain that's taking things in and helping you react to them. Facial perception, prosaic language. You often hear it called the more like creative side. I think that's a little simplified, but it gives you an overview of it. So we really need to integrate those two together. And you can kind of think of it like story problems. You're looking at a story problem, you have a new situation, you're learning about a scene, you're imagining it, you're seeing yourself in it, and you have to take from that scene logical information and process it and come up with a math problem answer. So if your two hemispheres aren't working together very well, that's going to be really problematic for you. So this can be sensitive throughout childhood, and it's really important to think about, let's see, just there's different periods. We'll get to that in a second. So toxic stress in early childhood can have really strong effects on brain structure and that develop later on in your older childhood, like we talked about with the seedling cells and other behaviors. But early childhood isn't the only sensitive period, and we need to keep in mind that it can happen throughout. The reason I'm hunching over here is because the screen is not displaying the notes like it did when I practiced, so I apologize. I want to get this one right. So from middle childhood, from age 7 to 13, emotional and verbal abuse can really affect the centers that process sound and language development and perceiving social cues. And effects can be different for boys and girls. So for example, neglect and sexual abuse can affect boys and girls equally, but neglect in infancy through toddler years has a larger effect on cross-brain communication and in boys. So infancy to toddler years in boys, if they're neglected, the cerebellar vermis isn't functioning as highly. For girls, it's different, and that section of the brain is more sensitive from girls from age 7 to 10 that have been sexually abused. So it's different for different genders, it's different for different time periods, but the brain that regulates different parts of your body and your reactions can definitely be damaged in very specific ways, and that's the takeaway. The other takeaway is the sequence of development is really crucial. So when your brain is developing, it does it in a specific order, starting with the basics that you need to survive and moving up to complex logistical thoughts. And as those parts are developing, they are the parts that are most sensitive to trauma. All right. So we talked about most of this. So we really have a choice when we are looking at the children that we work with and the issues that we're trying to prevent and the social public health issues that we really want to promote or prevent. We have a choice of how we look at it. Do we want to just look at the issue itself, or do we want to really look at the holistic child and what's going on with their reactions to things? Why are kids reacting in a certain way? Why are they not behaving in class? Well, maybe because they were trained and are wired to behave in a different way, and we need to come to where they're at, and we have that choice. So before we move on to the ACE study, I just want to know if anyone has any questions about the basic brain development.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It might be more appropriate when we get to the application part of your talk, but I keep wondering, I know that brain scientists are doing things that enable them to peer into the brain with the results that amaze me. So I'm wondering, how can these effects be diagnosed in that way? And if so, how early?
That's a really good question, and I can partially answer it. I think there are a lot of brain scans that can be done to know what's going on with brain development and where kids are at. I think in a more practical and probably cheaper alternative, having kids interacting with professionals who understand brain development and child development would be really helpful. But yeah, from what I understand, brain scans can really reveal a lot of information about what's happened to a child and how their development is proceeding. And Martin Teicher, who did all of this work to put together these slides, really has done controlled brain studies where they're looking at the brain development and the child development in conjunction with children who have and have not experienced these disorders, and are able to narrow down then really specific effects. So I think they're just expanding constantly.
And illness also can play a big part of this, right? Childhood illnesses.
Yeah, and the ACE study is less about that, and we'll talk about that in a second. I think anything that causes stress to a child is going to affect the cortisol levels and the stress hormone levels in their brain. And there are a lot of different things that can do that. The work that we're going to talk about today is more about relationship, and that's more of where my area expertise is. But yeah, I think anything that's causing stress levels, it's a chemical reaction in your brain that's causing a lot of this.
When you say the brain is damaged, you're saying that the connections that would either form one chemical hormone to or another are damaged. It's more the connections that are damaged. Is that correct?
Sometimes the cells themselves can actually die as well, but often it is the connections aren't made and aren't formulated. But yes, there can be cell death or damage to cells beyond just the connections.
Anna,
Yeah.
can I answer that further?
Please.
Do you mind?
No, not at all.
Okay. So Martin Teicher, that research that he's actually doing, and this will help with your question. Hope you don't mind. if I
Come
do
on
that
up,
here.
Lorraine.
Okay. So what he's doing is he's actually looking at adult brains, and he's questioning the people who had abuse or who did not have abuse. And he's comparing what their brains look like as adults and saying, okay, so we know that if you were neglected, 0 to 3, and you're a male, there's certain parts of your brain, the cerebellum vermis and the corpus callosum, are affected. So instead of doing a brain scan, one of the things that we can do is look at a child and what happened to them and say, because this happened, this child has a far increased risk for future things going on. So we're not looking as much at what damage was actually done, because as Anna said, sometimes that doesn't show up until adolescence or post-adolescence. It can show up since the teenage brain is developing all the way up into 26, 27, somewhere 25. that may not show up until that whole period. So we can't look at a child's brain and say, yes, this is damaged. We don't know that until those neural connections don't get made.
That's great. Thanks, Lorraine. That was really helpful. I told them when they came, Teresa and Lorraine, that we might be calling on them for some specified information. So that was perfect. All right. So one thing I want to talk about is that it's not just trauma that comes from parents that can cause brain damage or this adaptation for a stressful world. It can actually come from peers, and it's proven that peer bullying can actually cause as much damage as trauma experienced in the home. So that's why it's really crucial that anti-bullying policies are enforced and children are taught at an early age to interact in positive ways, because it actually can cause that toxic stress to build up in a child's brain as from a peer, not just from a parent. So it's really a crucial thing, and it's a hot topic these days. So I think that it's something people are pretty aware of. This is just one example of a trauma-informed school discipline program over in Walla Walla, Washington is using. They have this big target, and every time a student and student have a conflict, or a student and another teacher have a conflict, they bring them into the principal's office and say, okay, where are you at on the target? Are you really flamed up? You're triggered, you're agitated, you're, possibly if you've lived in a stressful and traumatic background lifestyle, maybe you just flew into this fight or flight or freeze mechanism and you're not ready to talk yet. Are you wanting to wait an hour? You're calming down a little bit, you're not feeling great, but you can take an hour and you'll be okay. Or are you okay, you're calm, you're centered and ready to talk? And the school has had amazing success with this, because most of the time, once we calm down a little bit, everybody can kind of say, you know what, I took a part in this, and I'm angry when this happened, and I can communicate that in a healthy way. But when you're really upset and you're in that fight or flight mode, that's not a conversation that's going to happen. And I think a lot of the time discipline problems are dealt with instantly, because everyone wants it to get resolved, and you're in the school setting and there's not a lot of other options. But if you have this time and and students are able to think for themselves and say, what am I ready for? What is my body telling me I need to do right now to handle this well? And it not only helps the problem itself, it helps students learn how to self-regulate, learn how to say, am I ready to talk or do I need to wait? So it's a system that's worked really well for the Walla Walla schools, and it's something that helps kids in the long run, not just in the moment. So those are just some examples. I have more that I can pull out if anyone is from the schools and wants information about it. All right, now we get to dig into the ACE study. So the ACE study basically links health behaviors as adaptations to adversity that happened early on. So basically saying that childhood adversity creates normal reactions that are not necessarily healthy in the long run, but we often treat them as abnormal. We have a picture of a cigarette here. Smoking we see as something that is not healthy, but perhaps it's a normal reaction to an abnormal experience that was had. And how can we deal with that better in the future? This study was conducted by two doctors, Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Felitti, and they both kind of stumbled upon this concept independently. Dr. Robert Anda was doing studies on smoking cessation and realizing that there was a really strong connection between smoking and depression. They were looking at the fact that it's harder and harder to smoke these days. You can't do it in most public buildings. You have to go outside across the parking lot in an awkward place where it's freezing cold. Like, it's not easy to smoke. And it's not as popular anymore. There's been a lot of public outreach that's been very effective in a lot of ways, but man, about a third of the population that was smoking won't quit smoking. It's just staying put. And so all of these great strategies that we've been implementing have helped, but for some of the population they weren't doing anything, and they were wondering why, and starting to realize that there was a link between smoking and depression. So that behavior was actually related to how people were feeling. Dr. Robert Anda, or Vincent Felitti, was working for Kaiser Permanente. That's a health, basically like an HMO in California. And he was doing an obesity study and was working with clients that were pretty severely obese and were really struggling and wanting to lose weight. So he had a clinic. People were successfully losing weight, losing like 100 pounds, more than 100 pounds, doing exactly what they signed up for in the clinic. And as they were losing weight, they were dropping out of the study. And he began interviewing people to be like, this is successful, this is doing exactly what we wanted, but people are leaving the study. Why is that? And found out inadvertently, completely on accident, found out that many of them had been sexually abused. So sexual abuse isn't necessarily always related to adverse childhood experiences, but it is, obesity is not always, related to adverse childhood experiences, but in this case it was a very strong connection. So he started looking into, wow, I wonder if some of the sexual abuse is actually causing people to eat more as a self-soothing mechanism. Another connection he made is that weight can be it can be a protection from unwanted sexual advances. So it can make people feel safer. As they were losing weight, they felt less safe and weren't comfortable and were leaving the study. So it was really an accidental discovery on his part. And so they teamed up, and through Kaiser Permanente and the Center for Disease Control, they did a study of over 17,000 participants, which is really tremendous. In the world of public health, it's really hard to get a study that big. So it's pretty significant. And really what they started finding was that adverse experiences were really linked to health outcomes. And this study was really unique in that it was studying multiple adverse experiences, and we'll talk about what those were, what they are. It was studying a lot of them, not just one. There's lots of studies on how sexual abuse relates to obesity, possibly, or heart disease, or different outcomes, but not how 10 different adversities relate to it and how that works. The study participants, for the most part, were, no, we're getting ahead of ourselves. They mostly were white and middle class or upper middle class. They all had jobs with health insurance that linked them to Kaiser Permanente, to their clinic that they were attending. So it was kind of, I don't know, run-of-the-mill population that doesn't have any flags for high risk factors for adverse experiences. Not necessarily representative of the country as a whole, because not a lot of minorities involved with it, but it's upper class, white, middle class, upper wealthy people. And they really asked them about 10 different adverse experiences. I have the questionnaire in the back, and you can pick one up if you want afterwards. But there were 3 categories. We have abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. Within abuse, there's physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. With neglect, there's physical or emotional neglect. And then we have mental illness in a caregiver or family member that's in your household. Oh, wonderful. Yay. Yeah, this one's a little blurry. Mental illness, demonstrate an incarcerated relative, substance abuse in the household, seeing your mom be hit, so not just being hit yourself, but seeing your mom be physically abused, and divorce in the family. So those were the 10. All of those are given equal weight. So if you fill out the questionnaire, if you answer yes to any of these, you get 1 point, or one score of 1 for each answer. So there can be a score from 0 to 10. And basically, it's really simple because of this. If you experience, or if a person experienced physical abuse multiple times, it's still only 1 point on the ACE score. So everything's really equally weighted. It's very simple. We were talking a lot before about individual brains. Now we're talking about populations. We're talking about epidemiology and not just individual people. This study is looking at a whole population. So as we go forward, because we are, you think about your clients and whatnot, we want to remember that the slides that we're looking at are talking about on average in the population, and they're not taking into account necessarily your ability to work with them or people's individual abilities to make changes in their lives. So we want to make sure that as we look at the slides that ACEs aren't considered like a death sentence, that it's more of taking the temperature of how the population is doing, and just making sure that adults, most of the time when you see this, if you know your ACE score, your client knows their ACE score, it's a relief because they already know they've been struggling in a lot of ways, and it's kind of a relief to find out information, but just being sensitive about that. So what was found was that ACEs are really common. Over a quarter of the population had parents that abused substances. Almost a quarter had separation or divorce. Watching your mother be abused physically was about 13%. Mental illness, 17%. Criminal behavior, 6%. Emotional neglect, 15%. Physical, 10%. And then sexual abuse, 21%. Physical abuse, 28%. And emotional abuse, 11%. And this really blew the researchers away because they didn't expect the numbers to be this high. It wasn't a population that they were expecting to have lots of risk factors for. And so it was really interesting when they got it back and realized ACEs are common. It's something that everyone's dealing with. So 33% of the population had not experienced, of this population in the study, had not experienced any ACEs. 26% had 1, 16% had 2, 10% had 3, and 16% had 4 or more. And what they really realized as we look at the graphs that are coming up, 4 or more ACEs is kind of the tipping point to having more health problems. So keeping in mind that ACEs are pretty common, everybody often has them, so only a third of the population has not experienced this. So it's a really interesting phenomenon when you look at these graphs. They all look like stair steps. And basically, number of ACEs on the bottom, from 0 to 5 or more, and the percentage of the population with health problems on the y-axis. And it's called a dose-response relationship. More dose, so higher ACEs, equals a higher percentage of this population experiencing it. And I do generalize a little because as they've done ACE studies in different parts of the country, it seems to be across the country. This isn't just in one study that it was found. So as more ACEs occur, like clockwork, more health problems occur in a larger percent of the population.
So in that graph, dose means a bad experience?
Yeah, so one of those 10 experiences. And the researchers realized that those 10 ACEs aren't everything that could happen to you traumatic. But they're common, and they're common enough that you can study them in a large population. Death of a parent isn't on there, and that's a very relationship-based trauma that would happen. But it isn't something that can be studied in the general population because it's not necessarily happening as often. Yeah?
So, how old were they asked to think back to, what's the age range?
0 to 18. So we knew from the brain studies that there are different sensitive periods that it is really important to learn about. This is much more generalized, and it's just from 0 to 18, did you or did you not experience these 10 things? Yeah, great question. So our first one I chose was about smoking and early smoking initiation. Here we have 0 ACEs. It's less than 5% of the population that starts, of this population that was studied, had 0 ACEs and started smoking early. Almost 13% of that population started smoking at an early age if they had 5 or more ACEs. And so you can see it goes up more than twice as much percentage chance of starting to smoke at an early age. Current smoking goes from about 7% up to about 17%. And so once again, more than twice as many people were smoking because they had 5 or more ACEs. COPD is chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder, so smoking related, lung related, about 4% going up to about 8%. So really you can see as you have a higher ACE score, the chance of having early onset smoking, currently smoking, or having COPD drastically increases. And they really are realizing that smoking can be treatment, self-medication for depression. So you're really looking, we talked about the cerebellar vermis being that seat of mental health. if you're not getting the feeling, the norepinephrine and the dopamine that make you feel good in a natural way, you're going to be looking for something that makes you feel better. And smoking does that for a minute. It doesn't work in the long run, but it does it for a minute. Got HIV risk in here, and once again, it's like stair steps. So hardly anyone, less than 1% of people who had ever injected drugs had a score of 0. And it's not very high in general, but up to about 4% then, just 4 times more or more, had a score of 5 or more. Having 50 or more intercourse partners, which can be an indicator of HIV risk, we've got about 3% of people who had score of 0, going up to over 5% of people with a score of 5 or more. Ever having an STD, we started at about 6%, going all the way up to about 17%. So really dramatic differences between people who had never experienced that childhood trauma and people who were dealing with the trauma. It can affect your behavior, and it can also affect your relationships. So the chances of being an alcoholic increase from 0 ACEs to 5 or more ACEs. And the chances of marrying an alcoholic also increase. So starting at about 12% for those with no ACEs, and about 34% of those with 5 or more ACEs. So the odds of seeking out relationships can be affected by ACEs as well. Depression is really interesting because it is it's different for men and women. But in both men and women, it has that same dose-response relationship. So that stair-step graph is still occurring. Women have higher rates of depression than men in this study, and I think that seems to be consistent with other research. About 18% for 0 ACEs, all the way up to 60% of the women in the study with 5 or more ACEs had depression, or 4 or more in this case, excuse me. So it's extremely, 4 ACEs and 60% of that population had ACEs. For men, the number was a little under 40, but that's still extremely significant. 40% of the men with 4 or more ACEs were having depression. That's a large population. And thinking about the numbers of 17,000 people, that was a lot of that population. Suicide attempt is extremely related to ACEs. We have a great graph we'll see in a little bit that kind of tell you how much can be attributed to it, and suicide's strongly linked. So the chances of this group, people attempting suicide, only like 2%, 1% had attempted suicide with no ACEs, 4 or more ACEs, and we're getting up to 18% of the group. So 18% of the people with 4 or more ACEs in this study had already attempted suicide in their life. And that's really significant. It seems like a really high number for a very serious thing. So ACE attributable problems, when you look down this list, and we have alcoholism, chronic obstructive lung disease, coronary heart disease, fetal death, drug abuse, mental health problems, obesity. These are the things that we're talking about in public health. These are the things that are costing our country millions and billions of dollars in treatment and prevention, and not necessarily talking about, wow, how can we prevent the trauma that's happening so that we don't have to deal with this in the first place. The child doesn't have to suffer through the trauma, and then moving on into adulthood, they don't have to deal with the health consequences of it, and we don't have to mitigate that in expensive ways. So Montana has its own ACE study. Many states have since done ACE studies. The numbers are somewhat similar to the Kaiser Permanente study, but we can't compare them directly because slightly different questions were asked. They only asked about 8 different factors in the BRFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey, and they asked about 10 with the Kaiser Permanente. And they also, it's different populations. This is a random sample in Montana, and that was a select group of people. So we can't compare directly, but it is interesting kind of to eyeball it. About 40.4% of Montanans surveyed did not have any ACEs. Moving up here, 17% had 4 or more. So about 17% of Montanans surveyed were in this category of 4 or more, which is kind of the red flag for higher health risk. So this is really, yeah, Michelle?
How many Montanans were surveyed? You said about 17,000 in the first survey?
That was in the Kaiser Permanente survey. I have the information on the handout in the back of the room. Teresa or Lorraine, do you know the number in the BRFIS?
I don't. Teresa?
We will tell you after this is over when we look at the handout. The BRFIS is done through the Center for Disease Control, so it's part of questions that are done on a regular basis. In this case, they inserted ACE questions into the questionnaire. So this information is coming from Child Trends, which is a different data source entirely. But basically, nationally, the slight majority of children have 0 ACEs. You have to think about children a little bit differently because they're not all the way up to 18 yet, so they maybe haven't had a chance to experience some of them when they're interviewed. So that's why the numbers might be different than the general population. In 16 states, more than half of children have at least 1 ACE. So there's 16 states that are kind of outliers for this. And the highest states of children with 4 or more ACEs were Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Montana. So as Montanans, we really need to think about this because it affects our children that we love dearly, and it affects our health of our overall population. It affects us economically. We know 4 or more ACEs is directly linked to a lot of health outcomes on a population level. So a couple of indicators for this that we have: 0 to 5-year-olds living with someone that has alcohol or drug problems nationally is about 6%, and in Montana it's 14% according to this Child Trends data. And that is, so twice the national average. That is 1 ACE right there. So more than twice the national average of children have that ACE instantly. 6 to 11-year-olds living with someone that has mental health problems nationally is about 8%, and in Montana it's about 17%. So Montana has, you know, in the Kids Count book, we keep ranking last for overall child health. We're having some issues. We're so proud to be Montanans, and we have so many good things going on, but we really need to pay attention to our children so we can be proud of that section of Montana as well. And it's a way that we are not living up to our potential at this point. So the mechanism for transmitting ACEs and kind of how they work is a couple of things put together. So they have the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, kind of explains the bottom and top of this pyramid. We know that when adverse childhood experiences happen, we can see this outcome of disease, disability, and social problems, and potentially early death. But we also, from neurobiology studies, we know that adverse childhood experiences disrupt the neurodevelopment, like we talked about with the brain. They cause social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. That leads to the adoption of health risk behavior. So a lot of the things we're looking at, heart disease and smoking-related illness, and pretty much everything on that list is somehow tied to behavior. There's a little bit that's related purely to the cortisol levels in the body that can add extra stress and wear the body down faster, but most of it is linked to adoption of health risk behaviors. And there's an intergenerational transmission of this, because if you are adopting these health risk behaviors, oftentimes it's related to substance use or potentially mental illness because of disrupted neurodevelopment. So you experience childhood trauma, it instantly can cause different negative health behaviors that create ACEs in your children. So it can be transmitted generation after generation unless the cycle is consciously interrupted. So ACEs are really common, they're interrelated, and they're powerful. As we saw, there are high ACE scores in the general population. It's something that is shared within a lot of different people. There's increased risk of these health and social problems. Often, if you have an ACE, you have more than 1 ACE. They rarely come by themselves. Often, you know, physical abuse is often paired with mental illness or with substance abuse, or comes coupled with several things. There are things that come in bundles. And then intergenerational transmission of ACEs can happen. So we really need to be thinking about this so we can stop that cycle. This is one of my favorite graphs in here because they basically used the population of attributable risk. There's an equation that they use for how much lung cancer is related to smoking. You can state basically any activity and how it relates to an outcome, and it's used in public health very regularly. And they use that same equation with these numbers, with the ACE data, and they found one of the most striking to me is suicide. 67% of suicide you can attribute directly to adverse childhood experiences. So by preventing adverse childhood experiences, that conversely means you could prevent 67% of suicides. Talking about marijuana use, I come from an office that talks about substance abuse prevention, and 54.3% of marijuana use is attributed to adverse childhood experiences. Binge drinking, 32.5%. So basically showing that if you can prevent ACEs, this entire section of the pie vanishes, and we're left to deal with the periphery, which is a lot less, and we have a lot of strategies that are pretty effective for that. So without dealing with ACEs, we're not going to solve any of these problems, or potentially we will solve one of the problems but push it into a different silo where we don't have to deal with it anymore, but somebody else does. Similar when prescription drugs were regulated really strongly and heroin use spikes all of a sudden. Well, people are going somewhere else because they're not feeling okay and they're looking somewhere else for that feeling. So okay, maybe smoking is down, but we haven't dealt with the root problem. Somebody's going to go and maybe they're going to eat a lot and gain weight, and we're going to have a sedentary lifestyle, and that's going to be a little bit different health outcomes, but still problems. So I just love this graph. I think it's so interesting and helpful in understanding policy and prevention on a population level. All right, so we all can contribute to preventing ACEs and preventing these negative health outcomes in different ways, whether you work in a school, whether you work in a position of policy or public health, or directly with clients. There's a lot of ways that ACEs have been utilized already in the community. It can be really empowering for people to talk about ACEs and learn about it if they've had a lot of experiences. Like I said before, most people already know life is hard if you've had a score of 8. They already realize they're struggling in ways that other people aren't and maybe don't know why. And so by filling that out and talking about it with a professional, it can be really empowering to understand, wow, I am struggling because my body is set up differently than other people's. My brain is reacting to the world differently than other people's, and I'm in a world where I need to learn specific skills to make this work, to make this function. I need to be able to identify what's going on in me and be empowered to take action to make my life better. So I think it can be a really powerful with parents who want to protect their children from getting ACEs. I think policy level, it's just really clear. Seeing the numbers, you can see that if you prevent ACEs, if we're able to intervene and make sure people have what they need so that ACEs are not occurring, then we don't deal with as many issues down the road, and it saves us a lot of money. And we really have the power to do that. I think this is one of the first steps, is learning about it and getting the word out. We're making sure as many people in the community as possible know about ACEs so that we can then start talking and using common language when we're talking between different silos. And we'll talk about that in the next slides. Good, we're still doing good. So capabilities, there are a few things that you can do. Everyone learns about ACEs, and it's just like this weight goes over the room where everybody's like, oh man, this is kind of depressing. And it is, it's hard, and it's a reality we're kind of aware of already, but maybe you don't want to think about all the time sometimes. I think ACEs in some ways are common sense, but the subtleties to it are really powerful. So learning more details about it. And for me, it's common sense, but then I look at things I do in my job and think, wow, I haven't been utilizing that common sense in my actions. And so really taking a hard look and reflecting at it. And there are different things that are known in communities to make them stronger and to bring them together over ACEs. And so first step, we're doing it today. But we need to work on individual capabilities of people within the community. We need to increase attachment and belonging. We need to work on building the community as a whole, culturally, spiritually, when appropriate. And these are tangible things that can be done. And so this is kind of the hopeful part of the presentation. We really need to be positively and let people know, empower them with the information so that they can make positive actions within their lives. people need to have self-efficacy and the belief that what they do influences what happens to them. When something feels like you don't know where it's coming from, anxiety or some sort of mental health issue, when you feel like you don't understand where it's coming from, it's really hard to figure out what to do about it. So by empowering people and giving them individual capabilities, you can have a more positive and proactive approach to how you deal with it. Self-regulation is involved in that as well, kind of that target that we were looking at before. Being able to say, hey, am I ready to handle this now? Do I need to wait till later? What do I need to do to take care of my body and myself so I can be proactive and take care of my life? Relationships with caring and competent people are really important. And this is where ACE awareness is really important. If doctors, if law enforcement, if policymakers, if everyone in the community, each individual as a personal and professional level understands ACEs, they're going to be able to relate to people in a different way. When somebody comes into a receptionist desk and they're having a really hard time and they're not necessarily acting in an easy to deal with way, if a receptionist is ACE informed, they're going to be able to come to where that person's at and help meet their needs in a way that will make everybody's life easier and empower that person to be they'll feel better in society in general. So those relationships are really important both on a personal and professional level. And we as a community really can foster our thriving community. We need to honor the culture that we have and make sure we're taking care of everybody, reaching out to the people that are in need, and looking at this as a community-wide effort that is breaking down those silos and is really getting everyone at the table talking together. We all speak so many different languages in our different jobs, and we have to really think about how can we act for the good of the community, because ACEs really do stretch across those different boundaries that we normally don't work with. I work in an office that does collaboration all the time, but mainly we work with social services stuff, and it's even hard in a collaborative office to break outside of those boundaries, and we're working at doing that all the time, but we always need to be more aware. So we need to, in order to do this, expand our leadership, make sure our leadership is really aware of what's going on and get more people on the front of ACEs. I think there are a lot of presentations that are popping up. I think in the last 2 weeks, NPR's had several articles about it. I think leadership is coming from all different parts of the country to step up and do something about ACEs. It's about us coming together then and working together as a team, sharing information that we know, and really making results-oriented decisions. So if you think about that oil spill graph that I showed you before, if we want to target preventing the most of one type of disorder, we really need to be thinking about this, because oftentimes the majority of people suffering from that disorder, it's due to childhood trauma. And we really need to work at lifting all beings. I think this is really a great opportunity where there is predictability, there is the possibility of preventing something, and that's really powerful. ACEs are predictable. They're incredibly predictable. If they occur, higher health risk on a population level does happen. And so how can we intervene so that everybody is lifted to the same level and we can all operate as a community together? And that's up to us. So we will have time for questions today, maybe a little bit of discussion about this. Because I am curious, first of all, if you guys have questions, and then I want to know after that about ideas that you have for ways that this can be incorporated into the community. So, questions. There's a lot of information. The silence, that was just everything anyone ever needed to know. Yeah.
I'm fully convinced of the importance and reality of what you shared. I'm kind of overwhelmed at the vast expanse and what realistically affected. Are there, that was a question.
Yeah.
Are there examples? Are there success stories? Are there programs that not enough to affect such a wide area if you want.
There's a lot of levels of answer to that. I think, like I said, the Walla Walla is kind of, Washington is used as an example over and over again. So that Target was just one intervention that they've used, but they've really teamed up with a multi-sector kind of coalition or group that's working on this. There are individual therapies that can be effective in dealing with trauma. There are, I feel like, programs. I mean, I work with a million amazing programs that are helping with parenting classes and we have a resource guide in the back of the room with a list of 40 different agencies in Missoula that are reaching out to parents. And we're always looking at referral to these agencies and getting more people in the door because we just are rich with services here in Missoula, and we're really lucky in that sense. But working with parents so that they're aware, I think that's really crucial. Empowering them and making sure they're aware so that parents want to take care of their child, you know, and they really need to be given the tools to do that. I think on a population level, I think devoting funding to prevention work is really crucial because it's down the line, it's going to be more expensive if we don't. Are those some of the answers you're looking for? Yeah, Shanna?
What some of my thoughts are is oftentimes with those populations, have there been any talk on how we actually reach those populations? So oftentimes we have these amazing programs that we offer and services, but we're not getting to the populations that we're not able to get the information to them. And so I'm just wondering, with this study, if there's been any more ideas or conversations about how we're actually getting this information to the people that can benefit the most.
Well, two things. First of all, I think we need to be conscious that ACEs are throughout the population. But there are high needs groups in Missoula, and I know poverty can be linked to a lot of high risk behavior. I know, and it adds just an extra stress and pressure. But first of all, we need to be thinking about a community-wide issue because people in my life, I know people with score of 0 and a score of 9. You know, it's pretty common. But there is a lot of work being done for outreach, not necessarily ACE-specific, but ACE-informed agencies. So Healthy Start is the group that I coordinate. Our resource guide in the back, we have thousands of them in our office, and we're working on getting those out. But it's kind of a guide for parents that are looking for services. We just submitted a grant to see about funding for some outreach for a website. So that has been converted to healthystartmissoula.org. We don't have postcards right now because we don't have the funding yet, but we will be doing that shortly. But that is a really easy website, mobile friendly, that parents can use. So we're targeting both print and electronic in that way. But getting it to people is hard. And why are parents not coming? And we have a survey that's going out in the next month about barriers to health access, which we're going to distribute online and potentially through daycares because they can't be people who are already accessing services. But there's a lot of stigma associated with it, and we really want to reduce the stigma. There's a lot of economic fears, so maybe something doesn't cost, but parents just assume that it might, or don't know about scholarships. So.
I think that just saying that this isn't just about poverty or about that it is something that affects an entire population regardless of where you're at or where you started. I also think this is a phenomenal tool to rethink how we are looking at those behaviors of oftentimes of having those expectations for a child is like, oh, well, you should be able to do this. But I'm thinking like, oh, well, actually, it's not just because they don't want to, it's because their brain can't do this. So I think it's another great way for providers who are sort of burnt out and to have that refresh of like, hey, this is an awesome thing to look at, that it's not just because they don't want to behave that way, it's because they can't.
Yeah, exactly. So we have Vicki in the back first. And then
along those same lines as to what she was talking about, we find in our home visiting services that we do at the health department, we work with young parents and parents. Changing their behavior is one of the most difficult things to do. If they're abusive toward their children or neglectful emotionally or physically or whatever, how, our question and our difficulty is how do we help that parent change their behavior into more positive parenting behavior. Teresa at Parenting Place works with that all the time, I know. And so changing adult behavior is also, I think, a focus that we need to think about in all of this, because they're the ones that are mistreating their children. So getting to the parents who are at risk for mistreating their children is such a difficult thing to do, getting to them, giving them information about this, but how do we really affect behavior change? It's hard enough in ourselves who, you know, maybe we have lower ACE scores, it's still hard to change our behavior sometimes. So for parents who have had trauma as children and now are trying to parent as well, very difficult for them to change their behavior.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part.
Someone right here.
I just wanted to mention that something that's going on in our community is through the Red Willow healings, and they're doing a wonderful thing with veterans through the University of Montana, utilizing this and finding that a lot of veterans who have PTSD also have high ACE scores. And so there's some talk that they be doing screening before people go into them. At least knowing who's going to be susceptible.
That's really interesting.
I was going to say, going back to kind of the hope too, where the youth development work that I'm part of, we, you know, it's not just, we talk a lot about that kids need 5 caring and connected adults in their lives, and a lot of them not even the parent, because sometimes the parent can't be there. So like, I was just wondering, so if we work through schools to help teachers kind of be more connected, to see them differently, like you were saying, like there may be other things going on, how do you kind of work with them in a different way, just because you understand that better? Do you guys work through the schools at all?
We're starting. So I'm Carol Ewan, who presented last month's training, is a psychologist with the schools, and I'm talking to her about it, and she has interest. I want to move cautiously because I'm not a teacher, and teachers are really busy people that need to hear it from another teacher to some degree. So I'm working on finding a teacher that is interested in this, that implements it, that utilizes it in Missoula. You know, eventually trying to bring somebody in could be great, but we're just starting those steps, but we know how important the schools are because they're dealing with the kids all day long. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
I want to agree with Vicki with what she said about the continuity of reaching out to those parents, making that intervention on that parental level, how difficult that is. We can feed them little sound bites of information to try to pull them into even thinking about, you know, any of this information. But then we need a continuity of care to plug them into so that they're getting ongoing information on a continuous basis.
Yeah, I think one time you don't make changes after talking about something once. Yeah, I think that's extremely true. And I think we can continue to work more as a community and have agencies work more to, I mean, there's a lot of agencies that are part of Healthy Start that are here today that are coming to join the conversation and figure out how to use this language with their clients and how to utilize it consistently. And I think we'll be working towards that in the future. But, yeah.
As an educator and now kind of involved a little bit in this youth and children network, I've had several discussions with people who they really don't want any more labels put on their kids or put on themselves. And they're very resistant to saying, but you know, if this really points in these directions and that you need to get some help, and I'm saying, well, maybe I don't want my kid labeled. I don't want my kid this. I don't want my kid that. When, you know, regardless of what his past or what his, you know, ACE might be, they really are very resistant to this. And it's really hard. And even when you're like in a school, I was a teacher, sometimes I would rather maybe not, in some instances, maybe it's easier to deal with that kid as he is right today, as he walks in your classroom. And to realize this is the child that I have at this point, and we're going to try to do the best for that child every day, and not get so wrapped up in the aces that he's, you know, you only have so much time. You want what's happening today with that kid.
Well, and I think an ACE-informed approach, not everyone is going to talk to the child about it. I think too much talking about it can re-traumatize the kid. But I do think you can take the approach, if you're aware of brain development and what is going on in a child's brain, taking the approach of meeting them where they're at and teaching them the empowering skills, and really that it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you, and keeping that in mind. And I think you can be ACE-informed without using the ACE words, I guess. So we are wrapping up. If we have like one more question, we have evals that are going out right now. So go ahead and fill those out really quickly. I need those in order to count this towards the master trainer credentials that we're working on. And I want to know. So I want to know if there's things we can do to make this more useful. Oh, great. Yeah.
Sitting here thinking about it, it seems to me the most comprehensive and specific community activity that affecting these issues is the legal system, where parents, not parents, neighbors and teachers report abuse, law enforcement and child protective services take action, investigate, and take action, and the judge replaces the child and approves of treatment programs, whatever. And I don't think I've come across the word cases or acronym. Just working with access.
Yeah, I feel like that is a system that we are working to reach as well. I mean, honestly, it's hard to think of a group or a silo of Missoula that is not relative to this, but that is a really crucial one because they're working with a lot of kids that have high ACE scores. We have some articles in the back about juvenile offenders and ACE scores.
And one thing that can be written into a parenting plan is for the parent to understand their own ACE. You know, those kinds of things that a court could.
Yeah, like use that as an opportunity to teach parents about ACEs. Teresa?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody know that Dickinson Lifelong Learning Center, I didn't expect you to remember. I'll be doing another training, only it will be the 6-hour, the long ACE training starting in May. So look on the Dickinson Lifelong Learning Center website. You can register for that class if you want to take an even longer version. It's very fascinating stuff. We love learning more and more about this. And I think the screening part is such an important part because that piece you talked about with a caring and competent positive person in someone's life, that word competent is very important, and I think it goes back to what this gentleman was talking about. If we know, then we are less likely to re-traumatize a parent or a child. So the more we know, the better we can do with our strategies with them.
And if I can just add, the work that they did in Walla Walla, particularly at Lincoln High School, the teachers just being ACE informed and using that approach with the students actually dropped the number of visits to the principal's office by 80%. So they saw such a drastic change just by changing how they approach the kids. So when we think about it in terms of how hard is this to do, it's not about dollars, it's about how you think about working with the children that you work with.
Great. Yeah.
Has there been any study or extended study of this, of finding people who are in the 4+ bracket, who have the personalities to overcome some of their background?
Oh, Lorraine, yes.
I'm right here. I'm a 5. And I do this training, and I'm a professional. So just because you have ACEs doesn't mean that all of those things are going to happen to you. So, and I always, because I do this training also, and I do tell people that, because I think that's the good news. If you can predict something, you can prevent it. If you know you're at risk for something, you can take steps to avoid that happening to you. That's why this is so powerful for parents to have this information, is because if they know that, they can say, I need to change so my kids will be healthy when they're older. And it works.
And I think that's a really key point, because a lot of people think of resiliency of like, why is this kid doing okay and going through the same thing as another kid? And it really is about actions that are taken, not just, I mean, the brain development, the brain chemistry issues occur across the board, but what actions can you take and what empowering steps can you take to make the change? Yeah.
With regard to using it in schools, isn't it sort of just a mindset that you choose to look at your students differently? Because you don't have, legally, I don't think you have access to any of the information about the child, whether there's, you know, alcoholism at home or any of that. That's personal information, right? So you're just sort of going on an assumption that this child doesn't come in with clean clothes on and maybe there's reason for it, that sort of thing.
To some degree. I mean, I think we do have to be careful and remember, once again, this is population-wide. So I think it's really easy to think of like a set group of people that are dealing with this, that it's not us. But yeah, I think teachers often know what's going on behind the scenes, and I think they can put 2 and 2 together in their heads. So yeah, it is. And teachers also get tired of hearing like, oh, one more approach, and this is the new system we have to implement, and we've got enough systems already. This isn't about a new system, it's about a way of interacting with people. You're exactly right. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. You've been a great audience. And we will be emailing you when we have other trainings.